Already? Thank you all for coming out today. My name is CJ Parrish, and I stand in strong affirmation of the resolution resolved. Compromise is a virtue to be cultivated, not a weakness to be despised. Because in a world without compromise is a world without stability. The weighing mechanism today is going to be on balance. What this recognizes is that my opponent is going to come up with times where compromise is not ideal. Compromise is something we should not pursue, something we should not have. And I'm going to give you examples where compromise is a virtue. It is something that should be cultivated and developed. It's something that is a good thing. We both have valid points. It's going to be up to you, judge, to weigh, more often than not, which one of our positions is true. Is it that more often than not compromise is a virtue, or is it a weakness to be despised? For definitions, I'm just taking it straight up. I don't feel like we need to define any of the specific words here. I want to keep the round open to the flow of ideas, since this is a very philosophical round. I don't want to define it in any particular way that would scope my opponent out of any definitions, any arguments, etc. But the first argument from the affirmative today is going to be that of interpersonal communication, primarily focusing on romantic relationships, but these arguments can apply to any type of relationship. As explained by Very Well Mind in April 2026 from a licensed marriage therapist, a virtuous part of relationships is collaboration, because compromise is an invitation to collaborate with your partner while solving problems. So what we see is that in relationships, standing your ground and dying on a hill is not a beneficial solution to a happy and healthy relationship, but this is quantified in the relationship dynamics study in 2023, where 2/3 of couples who reported they regularly compromised also reported generally happier relationships than the 1/3 of couples who either never compromised or rarely compromised. So what we see is on a quantifiable level. You can actually measure the fact that people who compromise in their relationships are happier than those that do not, because compromise allows the relationship to continue forward if you can reach the compromise. Obviously, there are instances in which you have a core value. Maybe you don't want to compromise on that, and that's okay. But more often than not, every single fight does not involve a core value you should not compromise on. What we're having for breakfast may be a core value to me, but it doesn't mean I shouldn't compromise on that. But the second argument today is going to be that of domestic politics, where I grow a little bit farther past me and my partner into me and the US government, or any government in particular. But talking specifically about the United States, what we see is in the 2025 George Washington Leadership Lecture Series, 4 different professionals from the Washington Library to lawyers to PhDs, people with PhD in history, a lot of people came together and had a mass discussion on this issue. What they identified was the core issue of the American government in the modern era is a lack of compromise. I mean, you've seen it. If you went on spring break and you saw the lines at the airport, that's because our government could not compromise for a funding bill, because Republicans and Democrats could not compromise on the issue of ICE one way or the other, and they would not even pass a subsidiary spending bill to get past that issue. In fact, we've seen this in 2024, we saw it in 2025, we saw it in 2019. Government shutdowns are becoming more and more common, because our government consistently fails to engage in the art of compromise. And part of that is at an individual level, we as people don't reward people who compromise. We view that as a weakness. We view that as something to be despised, especially in our politicians. Whenever we see somebody from the left make a compromise with somebody from the right, we call them a traitor. On the right, whenever they make a compromise, they step across the line a little bit to the center, you see Trump blasting them on Truth Social. We live in a society right now where our government is demonized, the weakness of compromise is despised, and what we see is happening is a failure of the government to operate at any efficient level. When we live in a world where we demonize compromise, we see relationships fall apart, and we see resolutions never become met. But the third argument today is going to be international politics, because on a domestic level, it's easier to say we're all Americans, we all have this unique identity. But it's harder to say that when we all live on Earth. What we see is that international compromise is the forefront of human development. Whether it's the Geneva Conventions, the Hague Conventions that establish basic human rights that people are supposed to follow and uphold. The United Nations is a compromise to allow us to move past World War II. What we see is that compromise is at the forefront. But a perfect example of what happens when compromise is demonized is the Iran nuclear deal, where Trump came in office and he tore down the nuclear deal because he felt we shouldn't be compromising with Iran. We're the more powerful country. We can stop them from having nukes if we just forcibly engage with it and stop them from having any nuclear development. But look where that got us today. Back in a war in the Middle East, bombing the absolute hell out of that country. We have our president threatening genocide of an entirely different civilization. At the end of the day, force to gain what you want is never preferable over compromise. Because when you use that force, you bring it to its absolute edge, and you throw out compromise, you throw out both sides getting something out of the deal, you don't lead to a resolution, you lead to a decline. Thank you.
Two minutes of cross. Anybody not ready? Starting time now. This is my second time debating CJ. It was on the negative before as well. It's a pleasure to do it again at National, so thank you so much. Great speech. I'm going to start with the framework for this debate because I don't want this judge to have to adjudicate a game of example tennis where you just list things and then I list things. Can we agree that there's two different burdens that are discussed in this resolution as phrased?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the first burden the F has to meet is virtue to be cultivated, right?
Absolutely.
And the second is not a weakness to be despised.
Correct.
I understand that you chose not to define anything, but can we at least get the affirmative definition for a very important word, which is virtue? What does that mean?
Yeah, so typically, when you define something as virtuous, you're defining it as something that is good, something that is morally correct to do in a given instance.
Okay, we can also agree that IPDA focuses on real world, not just idealism, but how things actually play out. Fair to say?
Absolutely.
Let's go through your most specific case. The first argument that you gave is about communication in romance. Why don't you cite the Gottman Institute?
Well, you have a source from the Gottman Institute. I'd love to hear about it.
I do, because the Gottman Institute, probably the premier people who study relationships. What do they say are the four horsemen of the death of relationships?
If you have that,
Okay.
I'd love to hear it in your speech.
Sounds good, I will. Let's go to the second on domestic politics over here. Thomas Massey is a good example of somebody who Trump hates, but often compromises with folks like Ro Khanna on the left. Is he despised or is currently leading in the polls for re-election?
Again, I'd love to hear about all this evidence. I didn't research your case because I didn't know your case. So
Yeah,
I'd love to hear this evidence.
I'm just saying what you cited, because you brought up domestic politics. You made the claim, pretty strong claim, that if we compromise right now, then we are blasted and we don't respect compromise. I'm talking about specific politicians. Who's a specific politician who compromised and then their popularity goes down?
John Fetterman in Pennsylvania, you can recognize his popularity among the left has decreased significantly. He's now moved to being independent, and I don't have the exact poll numbers, but my understanding he's getting challenged from both Republicans and Democrats because he's been ousted from all parties.
He's been more popular with centrists.
It's very limited with the United States. So on balance, the average American despises that idea of compromise.
6 minutes. Anyone not ready? Starting time now. When something only works, when both actors are acting in good faith, then it is a dream, it is not a reality. Because I agree with that principle, I'm proud to negate today's resolution, which on face seems like it is correct, but in reality, there are just too many gaps for my opponent to meet what he acknowledges are two of his burdens. He didn't provide definitions. I will. These come from Oxford and Merriam-Webster. This is front page of Google stuff. A virtue is something that is good and useful, a practical tool for us to do. Compromising involves making concessions when faced with disputes, and when something is despised, just means that we feel contempt. We don't like it. Let's go more specifically into my opponent's case. He says on balance. That's not what the resolution says. This resolution makes two categorical claims. The first claim is it is a virtue to be cultivated. It is a practical thing that we should do. The second thing is, as it is virtue to be cultivated, it is not, that word not, a weakness to be despised. If I can show that, while at times you want to cultivate it, at times it should be despised, then you want to negate. My opponent chose this topic that had two burdens. He had different options. That's why I'm proud to negate this. Let's go into his case, because he has the burden of proof. His first is on communication and romance. However, even though he cites very well-mined, notice he doesn't give you some down-to-earth scenarios of what happens. At times, we should not be compromising in our relationships. For example, if somebody cheats in the relationship, it is generally a bad idea to invite the cheater back into the fold. If I am just straight up wrong about how far it's going to take to drive to a particular place, and my spouse, who is watching in the corner, is right, and she compromises with me, then we are both incorrect. My opponent gives you no quantification. He says that 66% of folks will compromise in a given time, but remember, the Gottman Institute is the preeminent studying group of relationships. The four horsemen of the death of relationships per Gottman all involve things like resentment that build up after the fact. None of them have to do with compromise in the moment, because compromise can be good, can be bad, not automatically a virtue. Let's go to my opponent's second contention on domestic politics. The art of trying to compromise has been disastrous domestically. For example, the January 6th was an insurrection. It was an attack on the halls of our government. However, many centrists, or folks who work in swing districts, said let's compromise on that. Let's be okay with pardoning the J6ers, many of whom have gone back and committed additional crimes after the fact. Let's try to have a mass pardon, just move on with the country. And the compromising mindset is what happened when Richard Nixon left office. Gerald Ford said, let's do a simple compromise, let's stop going after Nixon, and has paved the way for there to be lacking accountability for the executive branch, which has allowed for the Trump decisions to happen decades after the fact. Compromise feels good in the short term, it is bad in the longer term. Now let's go into his shutdown argument. However, the shutdowns are resolved, each of them in turn, and shutdowns have been happening consistently for the last 50, 60 years or so. Sometimes when you compromise on a shutdown, it means that you are getting rid of basic moral norms. My opponent has an overbroad evidence here. He doesn't cite specific shutdowns, but his claim that your popularity goes down if you compromise now is just totally untrue. Thomas Massie of Kentucky, popularity up. John Fetterman, net popularity up. Rand Paul, net popularity up. Let's look at the great example of the current mayor of New York. He ran on Trump is a fascist, and then when he goes and meets with Trump, the two of them are lauded for having what seems like a nice relationship. So I think that my opponent's mindset argument is just totally off base, though I respect him for making it. Let's go to the third argument on international compromise. This is completely incorrect. He's basically citing Francis Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama claimed in the 1990s that we've reached the end of history because we're in a state of international institutions. But the reason that things like the Iran war are happening now is because institutions that are mainly built on compromise are really ineffective. What has the United Nations done to deal with Iran? Basically nothing, lacking human aid. Has NATO been effective in stopping the war in Ukraine? No, the war has been going for a series of years in an institution that is built on compromise. And then, on the Iran nuclear deal, the issue is that they were acting in bad faith throughout those decades, continuing to be sources of non-state terror like funding the Houthis, and they were enriching and killed many thousands of their protesters. All of these were things we wanted to liberalize, but Putin's compromise mindset has caused more pain. Let's go to the net case. Contention 1, compromise is not a virtue. Again, it's not a virtue. Subpoint A, healthcare compromise is harmful. A 2022 systematic review in the BMJ Open Journal, looking at 31 other studies, found that compromising on health gives falsehood of more legitimacy. They cite over 1,700 cases of harm being caused when we compromised and allowed folks to take ivermectin, which is basically a horse pill, to deal with COVID. That happened in a single year. Do not compromise on health. Subpoint B, business compromise is not virtuous. Again, business compromise, not virtuous. 2021 study from PubMed indicates that when you start allowing bad things to go through, they get even worse. Think about, for instance, the idea that Boeing and Spirit Aerosystem compromise on safety. They failed 33 out of 89 different audits, but the government kept allowing them more time to fix until, as you remember, a 737 MAX door plug blew out in the middle of Washington. That's what happens when you compromise on safety. Contention 2 should be despised. Again, should be despised. Subpoint A, don't compromise on justice. The Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction, ended federal troops in the South, and allowed the KKK to start oppressing minorities. Subpoint B, don't negotiate with terror. The U.S. Holocaust Museum reports that in 1938, we compromised with Hitler, rewarding his bad faith actions and allowing him to annex Czechoslovakia. For all these reasons, very proud to negate.
All right, 2 minutes on the clock. Everybody ready?
Yes, sir.
So I want to jump in briefly with this idea of the talk case. So is it your argument that the negative burden today is just to show that in some instances, it is in fact, one of these two things is true, that it is in fact not a virtue, it is
the way I phrase it is that there's 3 doors the judge can judge that are open at the end of this round. The first door says that both of these things are true. The second door says only one of them is true, in which case you negate, or neither of them are true, in which case you negate. That's
Absolutely.
negative.
I'm just trying to get the idea of the scale here. So are you saying that as a negative, if you prove one instance that compromise was a weakness, that therefore it's a negative value?
If I show that it's a weakness to be despised, then it's a negative value.
Yeah, but in one instance. Just one particular example is all the negative.
It has to be a significant example, of course. I don't think it should be like a little blip on the flow, but that's what the resolution calls for.
And so you're saying the affirmative, this resolution calls for the affirmative to prove in all instances compromise is a virtue.
This is the topic that you chose. It's an absolute topic. It's not an on-balance topic.
We'll move on to that. So specifically on your own case, this idea of how it's not a virtue, can you give me an idea, what specifically do you mean when you say a healthcare compromise?
Yeah, so for example, we had early during COVID, there was an argument that we should not be very aggressive in going against misinformation because we thought it might further radicalize folks who are misinformed. That led to real on-the-ground harm, with some hospitals allowing folks to come in, take ivermectin, which is something that does not help with COVID, which ended up hospitalizing an additional 1,700 people. That is healthcare compromise.
Right, so the compromise in this instance, you're saying that the hospitals themselves were giving people ivermectin to take?
Yes.
Okay. And how widespread, like, what is the source that specifically says that hospitals were giving ivermectin? Like,
this is a systematic review looking at 31 others in the BMJ Open Journal. I'm happy to give you the citation after the round if you'd like, but I promise you this is true.
Okay. And specifically on your second argument of how it is to be decided, with this idea of reconstruction, can you identify what was the compromise that was coming?
Yes.
What did both sides concede?
Rutherford B. Hayes gets to be president. He's the northerner, and then we're going to pull federal troops out of the south.
Okay, but that was based on an election, though. That's how we decided that president.
No. It's called the corrupt bargain.
Right. 3 minutes on the clock. Is everybody ready? So this speech, I'm going to start briefly with identifying some issues with the defining of the round that the negative has provided, and then go into my own responses to everything that's said in that speech. So specifically with the resolution, this is not an absolute. It does not say compromise is always a virtue to always be cultivated. No point does it identify this is in all circumstances. In fact, this is a quote, inherently implying this is a philosophical discussion, not an absolute identification of how every single situation always needs to be handled. And I explicitly identified that in my framing of the case, that this is not a discussion of is it always virtuous to compromise, is it always wrong to compromise. That is not the debate there today. What the negative wants is to have their cake and eat it too. They want to say that as a negative, if they can just prove a singular instance in all of society that is somewhat significant of compromise being bad, that they have won today's round. And judge, do not buy that argument. That is not debate, and as the app, I have the right to define, I have the right to frame, and I framed it specifically as we're taking this straight up with the definitions, but the definitions are not the issue. Nothing in the resolution defines it as an absolute. Neither one of us have to argue 100% one, 100% the other. That's why the weighing mechanism is on balance. It is your job to weigh who is more often than not correct in this instance. Let's go briefly into the responses in my case. My first argument of communication at times, what my opponent talks about is that resentment after the fact is what causes a relationship to break down. But judge, what creates that resentment? It's having a partner who does not compromise. It's you always fighting to get your way in a particular issue. That is what builds resentment. I gave you quantifiable evidence that the couples who compromise, when they engage in both sides getting something they want, they are happier. They have less resentment. You don't get to those four horsemen when you compromise. Yes, a lack of compromise is itself not the innate downfall of the relationship, but the repercussions of it are. My second argument, in domestic politics, my opponent talks about how it's creates a lack of accountability at the higher levels when we compromise, but the alternative to that is a complete lack of government. Government only exists on the basis of compromise, and I cited you multiple scholars in a broad institute of leadership lectures talking and identifying this as the #1 problem in the United States, is that we don't treat compromise as a virtue. Even the example of Mondami, if we do treat him as virtuous, that's beneficial for my side. That's somebody who is doing a good job, who's making policy happen because we view him and his compromises as virtuous. What I said on the point of if we view compromise as bad, we don't have people like Mondami. On the third point of the Iran war, again, it's conflated this idea that the Iran deal wasn't working. It was in fact working. It was giving a better outcome than all-out war. On my opponent's first argument of not a virtue when it comes to healthcare compromise, there was no concession, no quantifiable impacts on the ivermectin thing. 1,000 people out of the hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. Again, it's a net positive to actually allow people to have a say in their health, to allow them to deny medical care, leave AMA. That's a common thing. On business compromise, if you never compromise, you don't succeed. You have to make deals. You have to negotiate. Businesses fail otherwise. On the second argument of just two random examples of where compromise was bad, I agree. Compromising with Hitler was a bad idea, but not everybody is Hitler. On balance, the average time to compromise is good. Thank you.
Okay. 5 minutes starting now. I want to thank you so much for being here. This is a good round. I wanted to set up a good philosophical back and forth. We've done that both on the substance level, but also on the framing of debate level, and I've enjoyed it so far. So I'm going to go into my opponent's most recent arguments, the line by line, then I'm going to go for the bottom line. What is the big picture in this round? Let's start with my opponent's most recent arguments, because I think that he may undercover a bit of my case. The first thing I said was that healthcare compromise is harmful. I cited a 2022 systematic review looking at 31 other studies that indicates that when we compromise, we give falsehood more legitimacy. All he says in response is that the cases of harm caused by ivermectin was not enough for it to matter. He's essentially saying there is a net positive when you get bad care that is going to hurt you. That is not a hill that you should die on. When you compromise on health, you get bad things that are going to hurt you, and there is no direct contest. He only says that he outweighs without doing the outweighing analysis for you. Subpoint B, business compromise is not virtuous. His response is that the businesses fail if they never compromise. Businesses should not compromise when it comes to safety. That was the argument that I gave you. I gave you analysis from PubMed that is not directly responded to. There is a broken windows theory, says there is a moral hazard when you compromise on quality. And I gave a very specific example of how when you compromise on safety and the government let it happen, they failed 33 out of 89 audits, and people die in flight because of that. That can be cleanly flowed across. None should be despised. He basically says not everybody is Hitler. But just like he cites little anecdotes that come from domestic and international politics, so can the negative. And I've cited examples that came from you in American history where compromises led to the end of Reconstruction, the empowering of the KKK, ending federal troops in the South, which were clearly bad. And then I gave you the example of U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum showing that Hitler was empowered. Even if not everyone is Hitler, the logic of bad faith actors being rewarded because their threats work during compromise was not directly addressed by the affirmation today. Let's go back to the aff case. In this round, the affirmative first talks about communication and romance. When I say that you shouldn't compromise when some version is just more correct because then both of you are wrong, there is no direct response to that. In response to the John Gottman Institute, he asks, what causes resentment? My argument is that bad compromise can certainly cause resentment. If you end up going to a place that you did not want to go to compromise with your loved one, and now both of you are unhappy, that was a bad compromise that causes resentment. Also, we keep citing the study. The study never says what they were compromising about. It is an overbroad study. He's asking you to do that work for you in this case. I'd ask you to hold him to his burden. Second, on domestic politics. He ignores the argument that January 6th was not compromised and then drops the argument of the government shutdown, and then drops the specific analysis I gave you on Rand Paul, Thomas Massey, Ro Khanna. He says the alternative is a lack of government. Not true. Unified government worked for America during the era of good feelings. It's worked for Singapore really consistently for the last 50, 60 years as well. And even if we agree that Zoran Mandami was good for going ahead and doing this, and I agree, he was good for doing it, that does not mean that it is a virtue to be cultivated. It means it works sometimes. Both actors like each other. That's not enough to affirm the quote. Finally, an international compromise over here, he says that it wasn't working, that ignores the analysis I gave you, that Iran was already breaking the deal, enriching, and were killing tens of thousands of protesters at the same time. He's citing outdated evidence from the 1990s. This is Francis Fukuyama's arguments. They're simply not true. So, let's go big picture. How does the round break down? First, I think that my opponent has failed to uphold the absolute burden that he gave. I said that there were 3 doors before, and door number 1, which is both of these things are true, simply have not been opened for you. But even if you think this should be a more often than not game of example tennis, the negative is winning the vast majority of examples in today's round as well, especially on the neg case. There's just more depth and breadth of analysis there. The second door that you could open here is one of these 2 things are true. For example, some of the time, compromise is a virtue. I think we can agree. Some of the time, compromise is a virtue. That is not enough for him to win some of the time in this round. The third door, though, and I think the easiest door for you to open and vote on, is there are certainly times where this is a weakness to be despised. It is a weakness to be despised when the actors are not compromising with the right information, or they're not compromising in good faith, because it empowers bad actors to continue being bad. So when you weigh all of the evidence here, the idea that on the relationship and romance level, some of the compromises are good, some of the compromises are bad. When you weigh on the domestic politics level, compromise gets in the way of accountability in Jan 6th, decades ago, centuries ago. When you weigh the arguments in international compromise, that bad actors can take advantage of international politics, like the Hitler example, and when you look at the undercovered examples of healthcare and business, I'm going to humbly ask for a negative ballot, so I look forward to CJ's last speech.
All right, 3 minutes on the clock. Is everybody ready? In this speech, I'm going to step back from the floor. You've had a lot of evidence thrown at you, and I want to break it down through 3 clear voters that should help you feel comfortable siding with the affirmative on your ballot. But the first voter we have to talk about is specifically this idea of evidence versus extrapolation. This resolution is not a game of table tennis. It's not just who can name more things. It's our ability to identify examples and explain how they apply on a broad scale. So what I gave you is examples of in domestic relationships. When you are in a romantic relationship, compromise generally makes you happier, more often than not. That is one example, but you can extrapolate that further to in relationship in general. If you always are willing to die on any hill, you view this idea that compromise is a weakness, so therefore you're not going to compromise, that leads to the degradation of relationships. That builds resentment. Yes, occasionally there are bad compromises. That does happen. In fact, at that point, it's probably just not a good relationship in the first place. That's not compromise's fault. That's two incompatible people attempting to compromise. Not every compromise is always going to work, but the ability to compromise, the effort to compromise is always the better solution than dying on that hill. But the second voter today is going to be that of compromise versus being compromised. My opponent's conflating the issues here. When you talk about the plan itself, you talk about healthcare and all these things where concessions are made by only one party, what you'll fail to realize is that the negative case didn't show you what the concession for the other side was. What was the concession for the people on January 6th? They had no concession, they got pardoned. What was the concession for the people taking ivermectin? They made none. What was the concession for American Airlines, or you have these plane development programs? What was their concession to skip safety lines? They didn't concede anything, they got to skip safety regulations. That's not a compromise, that is becoming compromised. Those are two separate words, and my opponent is conflating today. So I want you to keep in mind, the definition they provided you is both sides have to make concessions. So all these examples where it's only one side conceding, such as with Hitler, we conceded, we gave up land in that example. But even if you want to say Hitler gave up something, which he clearly didn't, not everybody is Hitler. And that's my third voter, is on balance. You have to apply the evidence you've been provided today, Judge, to the average person in the average situation. What happens more often than not? Debate is not a discussion of absolutes. Winning on technicalities that you can prove one example is not the goal of IPDA. The purpose of debate is to have real-world discussions about real issues. So look at the real issues I provided. I've shown you the American government and all collaborative governments, which have lasted this long, have failed to survive lack of compromise. They shut down, they get nothing done, it harms the people on balance. On an individual level, relationships deteriorate and are less happy on balance when you don't compromise. The average couple is worse off when they don't compromise. And while there are some examples where maybe compromising was a bad idea, the average couple is better off. Now on an international level, when you look at the Iran deal, my opponent cites, I'm citing sources from the 1990s. The Iran deal was built in 2015. That cannot be true. I'm not citing outdated sources. What you are seeing is the opposite of compromise. When we don't compromise, it leads to war, it leads to death, it leads to loss. So go down.
Correct.
That's all.
Thank you so much.